We are back, and you're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. The Biden administration is attempting to continue their aggressive behavior towards China as the Ukraine crisis threatens to spiral out of control. Also, a controversial bill to give $40 billion to the Ukraine war effort is stalled, and a new world economic order seems to be coming into vision. Joining us to discuss this, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, a historian, and a researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
First article we're covering says U.S. is having trouble finding Asian countries willing to shoot missiles at China. What was supposed to be a satirical headline is actually just an instance of saying the quiet part out loud. And I think their troubles have increased with the election of one Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in the Philippines. That's certainly an interesting turn of events. Dr. Horne, your thoughts on what's happening in the, as they say in the Pentagon, the Indo-Pacific area?
Well, it's apparent that Mr. Biden has maneuvered himself and the class that he represents into a kind of quagmire. What I mean is that it was not so long ago, during the Obama-Biden years, from 2008 to 2016, that we were told emphatically that there should be a pivot towards Asia. Mr. Trump took up that clarion call and slapped sanctions up on China, which is what they meant by the pivot towards Asia. China's the ball game. China's the big enchilada. And yet we find U.S. imperialism being bogged down in Ukraine. Indeed, in their attempt to create a new Afghanistan for Moscow, not unlike what happened in the 1980s with regard to the Soviet Union when U.S. imperialism aligned with religious zealots in Kabul, Afghanistan. Apparently what's happening is that quicksand is being created for U.S. imperialism, not being agile enough to pivot towards Asia and fight in Central and Eastern Europe at the same time. And so therefore this week, you saw the meeting at the White House of ASEAN leaders, Association of Southeast Asian Nation Leaders. On May 24th, you'll see Mr. Biden taking off, throwing caution to the winds and jetting to Japan and probably South Korea as well in order to firm up this anti-China alliance. And at the same time, you see this very disturbing quote in the Washington Post a few days ago by Japan's Defense Minister Kishi, who suggested that, yes, there is a linkage between Ukraine and Taiwan. There is a linkage between conflict with Russia on the one hand and China on the other. Insofar as the Ukraine crisis, he suggested, in many ways is a dress rehearsal for a coming and impending crisis with regard to Taiwan. So this so-called satirical headline was more relevant, I'm afraid to say, than the creators intended, which is why it was taken so seriously. Because as you survey the political landscape in the United States, you see that in the all-important race for the U.S. Senate in Ohio, you have two candidates, Republican J.D. Vance of Hillbilly Elegy fame, turned into a minor motion picture starring Glenn Close, as I recall, and the Democrat Tim Ryan. Both have China in the crosshairs. Both are suggesting that the problem with the Rust Belt in Ohio was that an uncaring, unthinking ruling elite shipped jobs across the Pacific, helping to buff up the Chinese economy. What they don't tell their constituents is that, yes, there were jobs that were shipped across the Pacific to China, but this is part of a larger Cold War strategy to pay off and buy off the People's Republic of China so that it would turn against Moscow, which it did. And then part of the payoff was this massive foreign direct investment. And then China, of course, waged war in Vietnam, which conspicuously had leadership at the White House yesterday as part of the ASEAN meeting. And so part of the problem we see in the United States is that except for rare outlets, such as the one which I'm now addressing, it's difficult for the constituency, for the electorate, to get a grasp upon these complex political and global issues that would help the United States dig itself out of the hole in which it has dug for itself.
The issue of the pivot to China in the context of the current economic crisis that we're experiencing that seems to be picking up speed, I think is expressed in the opposition to this $40 billion that has passed the House, that's hung up in the Senate, that's in question, appears to be headed to go through. But we see so much pushback on that from the public and from even populist movements on the right. So how do the oncoming recession and all of these problems affect the Biden and the neocons' ability to express their militaristic foreign policies in both Ukraine and China and the Indo-Pacific?
Well, part of the problem the Democrats face is that Mr. Biden and many of the Democrats are pointing the finger of accusation at Moscow with regard to inflation in the United States and rising prices, rising gasoline prices in the first instance. The problem there is that by reminding the electorate of Russia, Mr. Biden is also reminding the electorate that his heedless charge into the battlefield of Ukraine has helped to lead to this conflict, which in turn, Mr. Biden says, is leading to inflation. And so, in some ways, by pointing the finger of accusation at Moscow, Mr. Biden is having three fingers of his own point back at himself. And then that leads us to the other point, which is that if you look at some of the votes in the House with regard to these Ukraine aid packages, you had virtual unanimity in the Democratic caucus. Indeed, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who distinguished herself as a dove about 20-odd years ago in the aftermath of the attacks on New York and Washington in September 2001, was on the delegation of Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Ukraine, has not distinguished herself as a dove with regard to this Ukraine crisis, and the same holds true for Senator Bernie Sanders. And so the problem is that this is going to allow conservatives, perhaps even neoconservatives, to pose as peaceniks. And given the fact that there is a lingering amongst the sector of the U.S. electorate for peace, this will be quite the electorate and probably a self-inflicted wound for the Democrats. That is to say, being so far out front with regard to their bellicosity and their belligerence in not only Central and Eastern Europe, but increasingly to Taiwan as well. However, I would call these newly Christian hawks, these reborn hawks in the Democratic Party, to look at the op-ed that appeared in the Financial Times of London this week from Anne-Marie Slaughter, a former State Department under Obama, a former dean at Princeton University. She has broken rank with the Democrats. And this is something that does not necessarily happen with frequency because oftentimes takes it very seriously when you break ranks on such a bedrock issue, such as Ukraine. But instead, she's in terms not far distant from what I've just outlined, that the United States not only might be stumbling into a quagmire, but compromising the ability to construct a new security architecture for Europe will put wind in the sails of the left in France. Said many times on this program, are geared to do quite well in the parliamentary elections in France in a few weeks, which could be quite damaging to NATO. Instead, that Prime Minister Boris Johnson of London, who has one foot on a banana peel, has been scurrying back and forth to Scandinavia, encouraging the Finns and the Swedes to sign on to, which will be quite damaging ultimately if they choose to do so. And if they are accepted, I would like to remind the Finnish folk that they should not forget what happened approximately when they were encouraged to wage war against Moscow. And it seemed as if they were doing quite well to begin with. But given the fact that the contemporary population of Finland is about 5 million, perhaps half that 80 years ago, contemporary population of Russia is about 150, 160 million. Perhaps that was a... And so eventually numbers begin to tell the story. And Finland barely escaped with its sovereignty. And it seems as if that lesson of history has not been ingested properly. And I'm afraid to say that in terms of lessons of history, the Democrats need more hours in the classroom as well, studying the lessons of history, not to mention going on an extensive study tour.
Well, I will say this about the Democrats. If they think that this abortion issue is upsetting, you wait till the Republicans have enough state governorships and houses to call a constitutional convention, and they will find out exactly what kind of problems lie on the horizon. Let me ask you this. I do want to throw this in because you mentioned Europe. I've been reading lately that a number of, I think the CEO or the head of Bosch has come out, that a number of German trade unions, German corporate leaders, et cetera, have been putting the squeeze on Olaf Scholz, that they have recently made a statement that said if Germany stopped taking Russia's gas, they estimated that the German economy would contract by 12% in 1 year. And that may even be a conservative estimate. Your thoughts on how everything that's going on here economically? You mentioned France, but Scholz, I don't think his leadership is long for this world. Your thoughts on how this economic self-inflicted catastrophe in Europe is going to affect things?
Well, speaking of Sergeant Schultz, and TV watchers might know what reference I'm making in using that term for him. He is stumbling, he is bumbling, but sadly, it's not himself alone. You need only look at his Green Party colleagues with whom he shares a coalition, who historically, I'm afraid to say, have had more than a scintilla of Russophobia within their ranks. And I think looking at this crisis from 30,000 feet, this is part of the problem. And you can see this by looking at the U.S. left and the pro-war hawks within the U.S. left who are bashing the folks who are against U.S. Increasing involvement in Ukraine. It's basically two wings, ironically enough. And you see this also in Berlin. On the one hand, you have Greens and Social Democrats, to a certain degree Trotskyists, who during the Cold War period were anti-Moscow. And then you have people who were pro-Moscow, but feel apologetic about being pro-Moscow during the Cold War and are now doing penance, they think, by becoming anti-Moscow in post-February 24, 2022. And that creates a certain amount of velocity and a certain amount of confusion. And certainly with regard to velocity, what's going to be happening to many of these European economies is not going to be very pretty. Look at the figures with regard to the shrinkage of the British economy, which of course then ties in to the recent vote in Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, part of Great Britain, where the Sinn Féin party, which has had historic ties to the Irish Republican Army, came in number one. And they, of course, do not necessarily want to remain in the United Kingdom. They would like to see a linkage with the Irish Republic, not unlike the Scottish nationalists who lost a referendum a few years ago where they sought to secede from the United Kingdom. And this bespeaks the fact that the current hawkishness that you see in Washington, London, and Berlin ultimately is going to be a massive self-inflicted wound. And the pity is that those who are inflicting the wound don't seem to realize what they're doing.
Do you see Jean-Luc Mélenchon becoming the prime minister? And if so, do you think that he will be stained by his association with Emmanuel Macron? I see Macron recently speaking with Xi Jinping, which certainly appears that he knows there are some people who want to tamp down the militaristic attitude of the French. What do you think about the Mélenchon issue? We've got about 3 minutes.
Well, it's unclear. Of course, if he comes to power, it will be part of a coalition that includes the socialists, which have more than an iota of what I would call Macronism within their ranks. That is to say, pro-NATO, not least. And then there are the aforementioned Greens, who are not unlike the Greens in the Federal Republic of Germany. However, what we do know about France is that historically in France, there has been more than a bit of skepticism towards U.S. imperialism. You see that to an extent reflected in some of the previous pronouncements of Mr. Macron. The problem is, as we said before, that French imperialism relies ultimately on U.S. imperialism as a guarantor, not least with regard to the neo-empire of France in West Africa. I would hope, and I underline hope, and I underline the conditional would, that a Mélenchon prime ministership would be more skeptical of some of the previous commitments in Paris, that would be a bit more skeptical about relying upon U.S. imperialism as a guarantor for French imperialism. But as you know, even if rhetorically, as of today, you have that left coalition in France speaking in tones not unlike mine, if and when they assume office, they'll be hit by a swirl of contradictions and conflicting forces that can force them to move away from progressive positions.
Thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, a researcher. He's got a number of books. You can go online to anywhere where you can buy books mostly, and they're going to have a number of his. My favorite is the book on Paul Robeson, Dr. Gerald Horne. You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. More on the other side. Stay tuned.